All right, let's dive right in, shall we? Today's deep dive is into a book that's been requested a lot, Fred Dretske's Naturalizing the Mind. We're going to unpack Dreske's ideas and see what makes this book so influential even decades after it was first published.
Sounds good to me. Dretske was really trying to tackle this big problem, like how do we connect the mental and the physical? How can we make sense of minds in a world that seems to be made up of just matter and energy?
Yeah, the mind-body problem, right. It's like the granddaddy of all philosophical puzzles.
Exactly. And Dretske's solution, his core thesis, is actually pretty straightforward. He says mental states are natural representations.
Natural representations. I like the sound of that, but I'm not sure I totally get it.
Well, think about it like this. Dretske uses the analogy of instruments, like a speedometer.
Oh, right, I've heard about that. It's one
Right.
of his famous examples.
Yeah, he says just like a speedometer represents speed by registering the rotations of a car's axle, our mental states represent aspects of the world by being caused by them in a certain way.
So it's not just about a mental state being correlated with something out there in the world. There needs to be a specific kind of causal relationship, one that's grounded in how the system, like our brain, is structured and how it interacts with the environment.
Exactly. And that's where Dretske makes this really important distinction between natural representations and conventional ones.
Okay, so what's the difference?
Think about our senses, like vision or touch. They're natural representations because they evolved to provide information about the world. Their meaning is built in, it's intrinsic.
Like eyes weren't designed by someone to see.
Mhm.
They evolved that way over millions of years. So their function, their purpose is kind of baked into their very structure.
Right. But now think about a speedometer. It represents speed because we, humans, designed it to do so. Its meaning is conventional. We assigned it.
Ah, I see. So Dretske is saying that mental states, like our sensory experiences, are more like our eyes than like speedometers. Their meaning isn't arbitrary. It's grounded in their evolutionary history and how they were shaped by natural selection to provide us with information about the world.
Exactly. And this leads him to develop this whole taxonomy of representations, distinguishing between experiences, sensations, thoughts, and judgments.
Okay, now you're getting to the nitty-gritty. Break that down for me. What's the difference between, say, an experience and a sensation?
Sure. For Dretske, experiences are like the rawest form of representation. They're the immediate, uninterpreted feel of the world.
So like the feeling of warmth on my skin right now.
Exactly. That's an experience. It's just the raw data coming in from your senses. But then sensations involve a bit of categorization. They're still non-conceptual, but they involve distinguishing between different kinds of stimuli.
So like the difference between hot and cold. Even though I might not have the full concept of temperature, my sensory system can still distinguish between those two basic categories.
And Dretske argues that these experiences and sensations, these non-conceptual representations, are the building blocks for more complex conceptual representations like thoughts and judgments.
So thoughts are like those higher level representations that involve our understanding of the world, our concepts and categories. And judgments are like thoughts that involve an assessment or evaluation of some kind, right?
You got it. And this whole idea of building up complex mental states from simpler, non-conceptual representations is really central to Dretske's project. He's trying to show how something as seemingly subjective and abstract as thought can be grounded in these objective causal relationships between our cognitive systems and the world.
It's like he's trying to bridge the gap between the subjective inner world of our experiences and the objective external world that seems to cause those experiences. He's trying to show how meaning can emerge from these natural information-carrying processes.
Precisely. And this focus on external factors raises a really interesting challenge to this idea of natural representation. If our mental states are so shaped by our interactions with the world, then what about introspection? How can we have this seemingly direct inner awareness of our own minds? If it's all about how our brains are connected to the world, then how do we know what's going on inside?
Right, that's the classic problem of introspection. If our mental states are determined by these external factors, then how do we have this privileged access to our own thoughts and feelings? It seems like Dretske's theory might undermine the whole idea of introspection.
It's a common objection, but Dretske has a pretty radical solution. He argues that introspection is actually a form of displaced perception.
Displaced perception, so we're not actually looking inward at our mental states directly.
Right. He says we understand our own minds by observing their effects on our interactions with the world. It's like we're treating ourselves as another object in the world, trying to figure out what's going on inside by observing our own behavior.
So instead of peering into some inner theater of the mind. We're actually looking outward, observing our own actions and reactions to the world, and then inferring what must be going on inside.
Exactly. He compares it to understanding the mind of a pressure gauge. You figure out what the gauge is registering by looking at the position of the pointer in relation to the scale.
Uh, that makes sense. We're not directly accessing the internal state of the gauge.
Mhm.
We're inferring it from its behavior, its interaction with the world. And Dretske is saying we do the same thing with our own minds.
Precisely. It's like we're constantly interpreting our own actions, our own thoughts and feelings based on how they manifest in the world.
That's a pretty wild idea, but it's kind of starting to grow on me. It explains why we can be so wrong about ourselves sometimes. Like we might think we're feeling one way, but then our behavior shows us that we're actually feeling something else entirely.
And this whole idea of introspection as displaced perception has some pretty profound implications for how we think about the nature of self-knowledge. It's not this infallible, direct access to our inner world that we often imagine it to be. It's a skill, something we learn to do by observing the relationship between our inner states and our outward behavior.
It makes you realize how much our self-understanding is actually shaped by our interactions with the world, with other people,
Mhm.
with the feedback we get from our environment. It's not just this isolated internal process. It's a constant dance between our inner world and the world outside.
Exactly. And that brings us to another big challenge for Dretske's theory. If our mental states are so shaped by external factors, then what about qualia? What about those subjective, qualitative feels of experience, like the feeling of what it's like to see red or taste chocolate?
The hard problem of consciousness. How do you fit those ineffable subjective experiences into this framework of natural representations? It seems like Dreske's emphasis on the objective, causal aspects of mental states might leave out the whole subjective dimension of experience.
It's a crucial question, but Dretsky argues that the seeming inaccessibility of other people's qualia is not an argument against their being grounded in objective external factors.
So just because I can't directly experience what it's like to be you, to see the world through your eyes, that doesn't mean that your experience is somehow detached from the physical world or beyond the reach of a scientific explanation.
Exactly. And he tackles head-on this classic philosophical puzzle, the inverted spectrum.
Oh yeah, the inverted spectrum. The idea that two people could have the same external behavior, but their subjective experiences of color could be totally reversed. Like what you see as red, I might see as green, but we'd both still call it red because that's what we've learned to call it.
It's a mind-bending thought experiment, and it seems to undermine the whole idea that we can have objective knowledge of subjective experience.
Right, because if our qualia could be completely inverted without any observable difference in our behavior, then how could we ever know for sure what another person is really experiencing?
It's a powerful argument, but Dretsky thinks it relies on a mistaken view of introspection.
He's going back to that idea of introspection as displaced perception, right?
Exactly. He says we don't have this direct, unmediated access to our own qualia that the inverted spectrum argument assumes. We understand our own experiences by observing how they affect our behavior, our interactions with the world.
So even though I can't know for sure what it's like to see the world through your eyes, that doesn't mean your experience is somehow detached from the physical world or beyond the reach of a scientific explanation.
He uses this great analogy of two radar systems that detect different points of the sky. They have different perspectives, meaning they're receiving different information. But that difference is grounded in their physical structure and how they're connected to the world, not in some intrinsic difference in their qualitative experience.
So just like the radar systems are physically structured to detect different parts of the electromagnetic spectrum, our brains are physically structured to process different wavelengths of light. And that's what gives rise to our different experiences of color. And that physical structure is a product of evolution, of how our sensory systems have been shaped by natural selection to provide us with information about the world.
Precisely. It's a really elegant way of pushing back against this idea that qualia are somehow mystical or beyond the realm of scientific explanation. He's saying that our subjective experiences, as unique and personal as they feel, are ultimately grounded in the physical world, in the way our brains are structured and how they interact with the environment.
I'm starting to see how this whole framework of natural representations really shifts the way we think about the mind-body problem. It's not this dualistic view where the mental and the physical are totally separate. It's a much more integrated view where the mental emerges from the physical, where meaning arises from our interactions with the world.
And that leads Dretsky to develop a really interesting view of consciousness itself, one that really challenges some of our basic assumptions about what it means to be aware, to be a conscious being in the world.
All right, let's talk about consciousness then. I'm ready to hear how Dretske tackles this big one.
Well, he starts by making this distinction between what he calls creature consciousness and state consciousness.
Creature consciousness and state consciousness. I'm not sure I've heard those terms before.
They might sound a bit technical, but the idea is pretty simple. Creature consciousness is just being aware of something. Like, you're aware of me right now, you're aware of the sounds in the room, and so on.
Okay, so creature consciousness is just having experiences, being aware of things in the world.
But state consciousness is about whether a particular state, like a thought or a perception, is itself conscious. So the question is, what makes a particular mental state a conscious mental state?
Ah, I see. So, like, I might be creature conscious, meaning I'm aware of things in the world, but not all of my mental states are necessarily conscious. Like, I might have a belief that I'm not currently aware of or a memory that's not currently in my conscious awareness.
Exactly. And Dretske points out that a lot of philosophers kind of conflate these two types of consciousness. They assume that if you're creature conscious, meaning you're aware of something, then the mental state representing that thing must itself be conscious.
It's like they're assuming that there's this inner spotlight of consciousness that shines on certain mental states and makes them conscious, while other states remain in the dark, so to
Yeah.
speak.
But Dretske rejects this idea. He proposes what he calls a horizontal theory of consciousness.
Okay, now we're getting into some philosophy of mind jargon. Horizontal versus what? Vertical theories?
Vertical theories, or higher order theories, as they're sometimes called, say that a mental state is conscious if we're aware of it. It's like having a thought about your thought, a kind of inner perception.
So it's like there's a separate mental faculty, a kind of inner eye, that observes our mental states and makes them conscious.
But Dretske doesn't buy it. He argues that a state is conscious not because we're aware of it, but because it makes us aware of something in the world.
Ah, so the consciousness of the state is grounded in its representational function, not in our awareness of it.
Exactly. It's a subtle but really important distinction. It means that consciousness isn't some separate faculty that observes our mental states. It's embedded in the way those states represent the world, in how they connect us to the environment.
So the experience of seeing a tree is conscious not because I'm aware of having that experience, but because it makes me aware of the tree itself.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It's a pretty radical shift in perspective.
Yeah, I can see how that challenges some of our basic assumptions about consciousness. It makes you wonder about those times when we're not consciously aware of things, like when we're driving on autopilot or daydreaming. Would Dretske say those experiences are unconscious?
That's a great question, and it gets to the heart of some of the debates about Dretske's view. He wouldn't say those experiences are unconscious in the sense that they don't exist. He'd say they're still conscious states because they're carrying information about the world, even if we're not attending to that information at that moment.
So even if I'm not consciously processing the information about the road while I'm driving on autopilot, my visual system is still generating conscious representations of the environment. It's just that those representations aren't being integrated into my higher level thinking at that moment.
Right. And this brings us to another key aspect of Dretske's theory. His view on the function of consciousness. He's not a fan of this idea that consciousness is like some magical ingredient that makes our mental states work.
So he's not saying that consciousness is what causes our thoughts and feelings.
No, he's saying that consciousness has a specific function, a job to do. He argues that consciousness enables us to identify and recognize objects.
That's interesting. So it's not just about having experiences, but about being able to use those experiences to make sense of the world around us, to figure out what things are and what they mean.
And he uses this fascinating example of Helen, a monkey who lost her visual cortex.
Oh, I remember reading about Helen. It was a really sad but also fascinating case study.
It was. She lost her visual cortex, which is the part of the brain that processes visual information.
So she was blind.
Well, not exactly. She could still navigate her environment. She could even catch flies, but she couldn't consciously see what she was doing. She could see where things were, but she couldn't see what they were.
Wow, that's so strange. It's like she could see but not perceive.
Right. And that suggests that consciousness plays a crucial role in object recognition. It's about being able to see what something is, not just where it is.
So for Dretske, consciousness isn't some kind of magical property of the mind. It's a tool, a mechanism that evolved to help us understand and interact with our environment in a more sophisticated way.
Exactly. It's not just some extra added bonus. It serves a specific function. It has a job to do in the world.
Okay, now I'm really starting to see how this all fits together. Dretske is building this whole picture of the mind as an information processing system, a system that evolved to represent the world and guide our actions. And consciousness, with all its subjective richness, is an integral part of that system, serving a specific function in how we make sense of the world and navigate our environment.
That's a great way to put it. He's trying to show how this whole complex edifice of the mind can be grounded in these basic natural processes of information and representation.
But there's still this lingering worry about this externalist view of mental states. If our mental states are so determined by these external factors, then do they really have any causal power? If my thoughts and feelings are ultimately just a product of my interactions with the world, then do they really influence my actions? Or are they just passive reflections of what's happening around me?
It's a common concern, and it leads to some really deep questions about the nature of free will and the relationship between mind and body.
Right, like if my brain is just a bunch of neurons firing in response to external stimuli,
Right.
then where's the me in all of this? Where's the agency, the sense of self that makes me feel like I'm in control of my own actions?
It's a big question. And Dretske doesn't shy away from it. He argues that the causal power of a mental state, its ability to influence our behavior, lies in its representational content, in what it represents about the world.
So it's not just the physical state of the brain itself that matters. It's what that state represents, what information it carries about the world, and how that information is used to guide our actions.
It's the meaning, the information encoded in a mental state that gives it its causal power. And that meaning is grounded in the system's history of interactions with the world.
It's like the meaning of a mental state acts as a kind of filter, selecting which actions are appropriate given the information it carries. It's the meaning that guides our behavior, not just the raw physical state of our brains.
Precisely. And this leads us to one of the most fascinating and challenging aspects of Dretske's theory. His claim that even though two systems might be physically identical, if they have different representational histories, their mental states can have different meanings. And this difference in meaning can lead to different behavior.
So even with identical hardware, you can get different software, so to speak. And it's the software, the meaning encoded in the system, that determines how it interacts with the world.
Exactly. And that's where things start to get really mind-bending, because Dretske argues that this dependence on representational history opens up the possibility of systems that are physically identical to us, but lack genuine mental states.
You're talking about zombies, right? Beings that look and act just like us, but don't have any inner experience, any consciousness.
And to explore this idea further, he uses one of his most famous thought experiments, the case of Swamp Man.
Oh yeah, Swamp Man. The being that spontaneously assembles itself from a random collection of molecules in a swamp. It's like a Frankenstein's monster for the philosophy of mind.
It is. And the question Dretske poses is this: does Swamp Man have a mind? Does it have thoughts, feelings, experiences in the same way we do?
It's a question that really gets to the heart of what it means to be a conscious being, to have a subjective experience of the world.
And Dretske argues that our intuitions about Swamp Man reveal a deep-seated bias in how we think about minds. We see this being that's physically identical to a human, and we're tempted to say, of course it has a mind. It looks just like us. It acts just like us.
It's like we're falling back on this kind of naive materialism, assuming that if the physical structure is the same, then the mental states must also be the same.
Right. But Dretske is challenging that assumption. He argues that it's not just about the hardware, it's about the software. It's about the meaning encoded in the system, the representational content of its mental states.
And Swamp Man, despite its perfect physical resemblance to a human, lacks that crucial ingredient. It doesn't have the history of interaction with the world that shapes our mental states, that gives them their meaning, their content.
Exactly. It might have a brain structure just like ours, but it doesn't have the history of learning and experience that makes those brain states represent something about the world.
It's like a book with all the right words and sentences, but no author, no history of being written. The physical structure is there, but the meaning is missing.
Precisely. And for Dretske, that meaning, that representational content, is what makes a mental state genuinely mental. It's what gives it its causal power, its ability to influence our thoughts, feelings, and actions.
So even though Swamp Man might be able to mimic human behavior, to pass a Turing test, it doesn't have the inner world of subjective experience, the rich tapestry of thoughts and feelings that make us who we are.
Exactly. It's a zombie. A biological machine that might look and act like a human, but lacks the genuine inner life, the spark of consciousness.
It's a chilling thought, but it really highlights the radical implications of Dretske's theory. It's not enough for a system to have the right physical structure. It needs to have the right kind of history, the right kind of connection to the world, for its states to be about something, to have meaning, to be genuinely mental.
It's a profound challenge to our intuitions about what it means to have a mind. And it opens up a whole host of fascinating questions about the nature of consciousness, the relationship between mind and body, and the possibility of creating artificial intelligence that is genuinely intelligent, not just a clever imitation of human thought. One of the things that I think is so cool about Dretske is that he doesn't just talk about mental states in this abstract way. He really gets into the nuts and bolts of how information works in biological systems. Like, he draws on all this stuff from evolutionary biology, neuroscience, even computer science.
Yeah, it's not just armchair philosophy. He's really trying to ground his theory in how real brains actually work, how they
Mhm.
evolved, how they interact with the world,
Right. And it's his focus on the biological that I think helps him address one of the big worries people have about externalist theories of mind.
which is,
Well, the worry is that if mental states are determined by things outside the brain, then they don't really have any causal power.
yeah, the old, if my thoughts are just a product of my environment, then do I really have free will?
But Dretske argues that mental states do have causal power, but it's not just because of their physical properties. It's because of their representational content.
So it's not just about the neurons firing in my brain. It's about what those neurons are representing, what information they're carrying about the world.
Right. And that content is shaped by the system's history of interactions with the world.
Okay, so help me connect the dots here.
Mm.
How does the representational content of a mental state give it causal power?
Think about it like this. Dretske uses this analogy of a variable resistor and a volume control.
Okay, I'm not an electrical engineer, so you might have to walk me through this one.
No problem. So both a variable resistor and a volume control are physical devices that can change the flow of electrical current, right? But a volume control has something a variable resistor doesn't.
Which is,
A function, a meaning. It's designed to control the loudness of a sound system.
so even though they might look similar physically, the volume control has this extra layer of meaning. It's about something. It has a purpose in the world.
Exactly. And Dretske argues that mental states are kind of like volume controls in this way.
Okay, I'm starting to see where you're going with this. So it's not just the physical state of my brain that matters. It's what that state represents, what it's about, that gives it the power to influence my actions.
Precisely. And this helps to explain how two systems, even if they're physically identical, could behave differently if they have different representational histories.
So even if we could build a robot that had exactly the same brain structure as a human, it wouldn't necessarily have the same thoughts, feelings, and experiences because it wouldn't have had the same history of interactions with the world.
Right. It's like having the same hardware, but different software. And the software in this case is the meaning, the representational content that's been shaped by the system's unique history.
Okay, now we're getting back to the zombie problem, right? If two systems can be physically identical but have different mental states, then could there be beings that are physically identical to us but lack any inner experience, any consciousness?
That's the question that Dretske's famous swamp man thought experiment is designed to explore.
Yeah, Swamp Man. It's such a weird but also kind of brilliant thought experiment.
It really is. So just to recap, swamp man is this being that spontaneously assembles itself from a random collection of molecules in a swamp.
Right, like a bolt of lightning strikes a swamp and poof, out pops a perfect physical replica of a human being. It's like something out of a comic book.
Exactly. And the question is, does swamp man have a mind? Does it have the same kinds of thoughts, feelings, and experiences that we do?
It seems like our intuition is to say yes. Looks like a human, it acts like a human.
Right, that's the natural assumption. But Dretske thinks that this intuition is misleading. He argues that swamp man, despite being physically identical to a human, lacks the crucial ingredient of a genuine mind, a representational history.
So even though it has a brain that's structured just like ours, it doesn't have the history of interaction with the world that gives those brain states their meaning, their content. It's like a computer that's been built but hasn't been programmed yet.
It might be able to mimic human behavior, but it doesn't have the inner world of experience, the subjective feel of consciousness that we take for granted.
It's a zombie, a biological machine that might fool us into thinking it's conscious, but is actually just a mindless automaton.
Right. And this thought experiment really highlights the radical implications of Dretske's theory. It's not just about the physical stuff, the brain and the nervous system. It's about how those physical systems have been shaped by their history, by their interactions with the world, to create a system that can represent the world, that can understand it, that can experience it.
It's like saying that meaning isn't something that's just inherent in the physical structure of the brain. It's something that's created that emerges from the interaction between the brain and the world.
Exactly. And that brings us to another big question. How did this capacity for meaning, for representation, arise in the first place? How did evolution create minds that can not only respond to the world, but actually understand it, represent it, and use those representations to guide their actions?
Yeah, it's one thing to say that mental states are natural representations, but how did those representations come to be in the first place? How did evolution create systems that can actually make sense of the world, that can have experiences, that can be conscious?
It's the ultimate question, isn't it? How did something as complex and seemingly miraculous as consciousness emerge from the blind, uncaring processes of natural selection?
It's a question that's been puzzling philosophers and scientists for centuries.
It has, and Dretske offers an answer that, at least on the surface, seems pretty straightforward. He says that consciousness, like any other biological trait, evolved because it gave organisms a selective advantage.
So it's not that evolution was somehow aiming for consciousness. It's that consciousness emerged as a byproduct of systems becoming more and more sophisticated in their use of information. As organisms evolved more complex ways of processing information about their environment, consciousness emerged as a kind of bonus feature.
And it's important to remember that natural selection doesn't just select for traits that are useful in some abstract sense. It selects for traits that actually help organisms survive and reproduce in their specific environments.
So our sensory experiences, those raw representations of the world, aren't just there for fun. They actually help us make better decisions, avoid danger, find food and mates.
Right. That contribute to our fitness, to our ability to pass on our genes to the next generation.
It's like the more information an organism can gather and process about its environment, the better its chances of survival. And over time, that led to the evolution of increasingly complex sensory systems and, eventually, to the emergence of consciousness.
Exactly. And Dretz uses this really cool analogy to illustrate how this process might have happened. He talks about the evolution of a variable resistor into a volume control.
Okay, I think I'm starting to see where you're going with this. So a variable resistor is a simple device that can regulate the flow of electrical current. It's kind of like a primitive sensory system, just detecting changes in the environment.
Exactly. And a volume control is basically just a variable resistor that's been given a specific function to control the loudness of a sound system.
So you're saying that early organisms might have had these simple sensory systems that could detect basic environmental stimuli like light or temperature, but they weren't consciously aware of those stimuli.
Right. It was just basic input-output stuff. No real understanding, no experience, just a simple response to the environment.
And then over time, as these sensory systems became more complex, more interconnected, they eventually gave rise to conscious experience. It's like the variable resistor gradually evolved into a volume control, acquiring a specific function, a meaning in the process.
Precisely. And as those sensory systems became more and more sophisticated, they enabled organisms to not just react to the world, but actually understand it, to represent it internally, to see it as a world of objects and events with meaning and significance.
So consciousness emerged not as some sudden leap, some magical spark, but as a gradual unfolding, a progressive refinement of information processing systems, driven by the relentless pressure of natural selection.
Exactly. And this evolutionary perspective, I think, helps to demystify consciousness a bit. It shows that it's not some mysterious entity separate from the physical world. It's a product of evolution, just like everything else in biology.
It's a biological adaptation that arose because it gave organisms a survival advantage. And if it's a product of evolution, then it's not something that's unique to humans. It's likely to exist in various forms throughout the animal kingdom.
Right, we're not the only conscious beings on this planet. We're all part of this grand evolutionary story, and consciousness is one of the most extraordinary chapters in that story.
It's a beautiful and humbling thought. And it also raises some fascinating questions about the future of consciousness. If consciousness can evolve, then it can keep evolving, right? It can change, it can adapt to new environments and new challenges.
Absolutely. And in a world that's being transformed by technology, by artificial intelligence, those questions about the future of consciousness become even more urgent. Dretske's work gives us a really valuable way to think about those questions, to understand the nature of intelligence, both biological and artificial.
It's like he's giving us a roadmap for navigating this uncharted territory, for understanding how minds work, how they evolve, and how we might create new forms of intelligence that can share our world and help us solve some of the biggest challenges we face. It's been really fascinating diving deep into Dreske's Naturalizing the Mind. His idea of mental states as natural representations, grounded in how we interact with the world, it's given us so much to think about, especially when it comes to this whole explosion of AI.
Yeah, it's like Dretske was ahead of his time in a way. He gives us this framework for thinking about AI that goes way beyond just, can machines think?
It's not just about building machines that can do clever things.
Yeah.
It's about understanding if those machines can actually have genuine mental states, if they can understand and experience the world like we do.
Exactly. And Dretske's focus on representational history, it makes you wonder, can AI, even with all the data we're feeding it, can it ever really grasp the meaning of something without having lived it, without having experienced the world firsthand?
Yeah, it's like, can you really understand what it means to feel pain, for example,
Yeah.
just by reading about it in a textbook? Or do you have to actually feel pain yourself to really get it?
Right. No matter how much data we feed an AI, can it ever really understand what it's like to be human, to experience the world through our senses, to feel emotions, to have relationships?
I think that's one of the big challenges of creating truly intelligent AI.
Mhm.
It's not just about processing power or algorithms. It's about creating systems that can understand the world in a meaningful way, that can connect with us on a deeper level.
Dretske's work really pushes us to think about intelligence in a more holistic way. It's not just about input-output relations. It's about embodiment, about history, about the situatedness of the knower.
It's about understanding how meaning emerges from our interaction with the world, from our experiences, from the messy reality of being a living, breathing human being in a complex and ever-changing world. Well, I think that's a great place to wrap up our deep dive into Dretsche's Naturalizing the Mind. It's a book that's full of these mind-blowing ideas that really make you think about the nature of mind, consciousness, and our place in the world.
It's a book that reminds us that even our most complex and mysterious experiences, they can be understood. And this pursuit of understanding, this search for meaning, is what makes us human.
Absolutely. And it's a search that's worth continuing with all the curiosity and open-mindedness we can muster. So, until next time, keep those minds exploring, keep those questions coming, and keep those conversations going.